Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for the 33rd Writer's Quote video here on the channel. And today's quote comes to us from Gore Vidal. Gore said, "Each writer is born with a repertory company in his head. Shakespeare has perhaps 20 players. I have 10 or so, and that's a lot. As you get older, you become more skillful at casting them." First off, far be it from me to be someone who disagrees with Gore Vidal, someone who is much more well-read than am I, someone who is a much better writer than am I, but I completely disagree with the premise of this statement that you are born with the cast of players in your head. I think that is short-sighted. I think that is something which, if you asked Gore Vidal what he really thought, he would disagree with that. But that said, I think that every writer has a certain number of characters running around in their mind, and they get better and worse at casting them as they go along. But I think that this number is constantly in flux. I think that someone can add to this number. I think that someone can forget things along this number. But I think that those characters are personal archetypes. A personal archetype for me is kind of like Bukowski. I have a Bukowski type character that pops up in a lot of my stories. Someone who's getting along to get along, more or less. Someone who struggles with his own fuckery, things like that. That is one of my characters that's just sort of always threatening to appear in one of my projects. The claim that Shakespeare had 20 and Gore Vidal has 10 or so, that's interesting. I don't know what to make of that, but it is interesting to think about nonetheless how many different iterations of a certain character pop up time and again in William Shakespeare. Hamlet, for example. Where else does Hamlet occur in Shakespeare? That character. When writing characters, one thing that often helps me is an old cliche about character, not character. About people, not people in books. Character, not characters. People, not people in books. Character, that quote says, and I learned this personally from Lou Holt's Wins, Losses, and Lessons. I don't know how old this cliche is, but I'm sure it goes back further than Lou Holt's. Character is what you do when no one is watching. And I think that's very interesting to employ as a writer. Character is what you do when no one else is watching. What are those things expressed in your work that happen on the page between the character and the reader? Not the character and other characters, but the character and the reader. What are the things that transgress between those two? One of the things that definitely pops up that is able to be employed by a writer in this situation is reliability. If that narrator becomes unreliable, it is a transgression between the speaker, the speaker and the reader, by which our reader will pass judgment on that character. Another thing, if your character is interacting, if your protagonist, your main character, is interacting with other characters in a way that is communicated differently to the reader than to the other characters, it says something. How are you doing today? Fine, I lied. This character thinks fine. This character thinks your main character is doing fine. Your reader knows differently. Just by putting that in there, fine, I lied. He's not telling the other character he lied. He's telling us, he lied. So that is an interesting dynamic that can be played with by a writer. One other quote that helps me when writing comes to us from Kurt Vonnegut, I'm pretty sure, and I'm not going to get the quote exactly right. You can always Google Kurt Vonnegut's Rules for Writing, I think it was called. Kurt Vonnegut's, hold on, give me 1 second here. I don't remember exactly. It's a very quick read. You hear me typing? Yeah, Rules for Writing might be it. It's a very quick read. Kurt Vonnegut's 8 Rules for Writing. 8 Basics of Creative Writing, something like that. But it is a pretty good list Vonnegut goes through, and one of them is make your characters once. I think that's on here. Tell me that's in here. Yeah. His third rule, every character should want something, even if it's only a glass of water. So your characters need to have a want. If your characters don't have a want, your reader isn't going to want to read them. So what is that want? That want does not only tell us where the story is going, not where it will end. A character can want to date Miss America. That doesn't mean the character is going to get it in the end, but it tells you what direction the machinations of the story will go. It does not only tell us where the story is heading, it also tells us about the character. If that character wants to date Miss America, what does it tell us about the character? Well, we will learn other things about that character along the way. If that character is not particularly good-looking, rich, intelligent, any of these things, right? Any of these things that people normally look for in someone else, it tells us the character's probably got unrealistic goals. B, it tells us where we're probably heading with a denial. But it's going to tinge the story with a certain type of drama, depending on what that goal is. The stakes are not very high for wanting to date Miss America, but the impending tragedy of that denial, that's a pretty big stake, right? The next thing that I want to talk about with this quote in mind is that I think when you are trying to build that repertory in your mind, it helps to realize that characters can pop up very easily in pairs by utilizing opposites. The main thing I like to look at when I'm talking about opposites, you need a couple characters, you got a couple things going on in your head. An easy one, someone who is really good at talking to people, but their weakness, they're an idiot. Versus someone who is really good at knowing things, at figuring things out, a very intelligent person, but they suck with people. Those are very easy, those are very basic, but you throw those two characters with those two quirks, those are the only two things you know about them, on a story. Just start there, you're going to get somewhere interesting. Those are the only two opposites you need to know. Those are the only two character qualities you need to know. Now, along the way, you should figure out other things, but you can start a piece just with those two characters and a dynamic. The stupid character needs to pass a test. The intelligent character wants to date a girl. How are they helping each other? That's a sitcom idea, right? But there's nothing about a sitcom idea that necessarily says it will not be interesting or that it cannot be something more than just entertaining. So remember, all you have to do is play with strengths and weaknesses. And if you come up with one strength, one weakness, invert them, and it can be the other thing, right? And you can just throw those characters in a situation. that becomes literally a sitcom. But you see what I'm saying with different stories working that way. Nick Carraway, not very good with people, but he knows Daisy. Gatsby, really good with people, wants to know Daisy, does not know Daisy, right? Used to know Daisy. Very simple dynamic between the two of them led to a very interesting story among the things there, right? You had Tom thrown in, you had all these other characters thrown in, but that's one quick example of how these things can work. One thing that I think is important to remember about characters when writing, to your character, it's always in media res. To your character, it's always in the middle of things, right? You do not find your character, even if you're finding your character at the beginning of a long journey. Your character wakes up one morning and decides, I'm going to gain 50 pounds of muscle, baby. That's the character's goal. I'm going to gain 50 pounds of muscle. That's where we find your character, the beginning of that journey. Well, it's the middle of the journey for that character because your character found some way to weigh 342 pounds of not muscle before this. So it's always in the middle of things for your character. Another thing that I think is useful with character development, with your repertory. What do other characters tell us about your characters? You've got a third-person story, and John walks into the room. John's approaching the room, and 4 or 5 characters leave the room. We know something about John. We know there's some reason they know he's coming. Is he always on time? How do they know he's about to be there? Does he smell bad? Is he a loud walker? Is he talking on his phone before he enters the office? B, those characters leaving means they don't like him. They don't want to be there when he is. Why is that? So there are always ways to use other characters to tell us things about our main characters. And those are some of the things that I think are really interesting about writing characters. And some of the things that help us along the way. That is all I have for this, the 33rd writer's quote here in the series. But I hope to have you back next time for another writer's quote.